What is mathematically the biggest possible single barrier you could produce in Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail? While far less of a competition than the biggest hit, still a very interesting concept to explore. Be sure to let me know in the comments which job you expected to produce this greatest number. And now, let's first check the rules to be sure. 1. The shield must be producible in any content that allows the party size that is required for the cast. This means, for example, that relying on echo from unsynced content to quadruple the shield is off limits. Going into field operations like Eureka, Bozia or Cold Crescent is also banned. Essentially, you should be able to do it near a striking dummy in a housing district. The barrier must, in the end, be produced by one single action cast. So, using various different barrier actions to prop it up is not allowed. However, if a single action happens to produce multiple barriers on top of each other, this is allowed. And 3. Assuming it is applicable, the action is assumed to be a critical hit, regardless of the probability. With the rules out of the way, let's both go over what jobs are effectively not really competing, and also the special spell healing property. There are 5 abilities in 14 that boost healing magic potency, which affects only spells, not abilities. Each healer has access to one of them, boosting by 20%, and then Scholar's Fey Illumination gives everyone access to an additional 10%. Technically, Scholar's Seraphism indirectly also grants a 20% healing magic potency boost, because Manifestation and Accession happen to have precisely 20% more potency than their regular counterparts. However, Seraphism is incompatible with Dissipation, so whichever one is used doesn't matter, as long as one of them are. The important bit is that healing spells universally have a 10% advantage over non-spells, and healers have an extra 20% over other jobs, and if we start talking about non-casters, healers having Maim and Mend gives them an extra 30% over that. And that leads us to the jobs that straight up don't stand a chance. Dead last is of course any job that does not have a barrier. Red Mage, Machinist, Bard, Viper, Dragoon, Monk and Samurai. Above them we have Dancer and Reaper, both capable of producing 10% of HP barriers. Then followed by Summoner, Pictmancer and Ninja producing 20% barriers. Dark Knight then produces 25% barriers, and Black Mage peaks that contest with a 30% barrier. Percentage barriers are incapable of critting, which is already a bad start, but it isn't the worst. Moving over to potencies, Gunbreaker starts at a measly 200 with Brutal Shell, while Warrior produces 400 potency, which, to my memory, tends to land around 8% or so of the Warrior's own HP when it isn't a crit. To my knowledge, it can crit. Not that it matters for this contest, it's not big enough. Which moves us into healer territory. White Mage peaks with 500 potency on Divine Benison, although relative to a job like Warrior, this is 30% more due to Maim and Mend, so 650 before we add all the other multipliers. The various multipliers of the user itself isn't super crucial to add this early, as among the competing jobs, there are only 8 that can provide a healing boosting buff to begin with. And the top contestants all provide one themselves. Which means that in 4th place we have Paladin, with Guardian's 1000 potency shield. While yes, technically Paladin could boost this by 15% with Rampart, all of the top 3 contestants can also make use of Rampart in this way, so it does not change anything. In 3rd place, we have Astrologian, using Aspected Benefic while benefiting from Neutral Sect, and their target benefiting from the spell-specific Fey Illumination for an extra 10%. With Maim and Mend included, this adds together for 1072.5 barrier potency, surprisingly narrowly beating Paladin, all things considered. Which leaves 2 jobs. The 2 we would surely all have expected to see here anyway. What I imagine many of you did not expect though is that the 2nd place is Scholar, using either Adloquium during Dissipation or Manifestation during Seraphism, both while affected by Fey Illumination, and when accounting for Maim and Mend, And when accounting for the fact that the barrier is doubled on a crit, we land at a massive 1853.28 barrier potency. It is worth mentioning, first, that manifestation ignores recitation, but second, that the mechanic where auto-critting actions gain a power boost from crit chance boosting buffs does not apply to healing, meaning that when we assume it will be a critical hit anyway, recitation doesn't do anything. However, Scholar does have deployment tactics, so we will get back to this one. That said, in first place, with the biggest possible shield is Sage. To start, if we counted multi-shields produced by a single button, Haima with Maim and Mend would already cumulatively offer 1950 barrier potency. However, let's focus on a barrier that is fully there all at once. Eucratian Diagnosis critting while benefiting from Philosophia 20%, Maim and Mend 30%, Zoe 50%, and Fey Illumination 10%. Lands us at an insane 2779.92 potency, before we apply any additional boosts, of which there are quite a few. I hope you're ready. Let's start with converting the potency to an actual barrier number. By putting together a set with as much crit and determination as possible out of our options, as well as recognizing, just like we did when determining the biggest single damaging hit, that the true maximum would be reached once we have access to relic weapons, which would in this case give us a clean 26 extra crit, pushing us to 61.5% crit power instead of 61.3%. Now, we can also use the 100 potency ratio this time to determine, when accounting for determination, that the average damaging hit would be 11,126 damage per 100 potency. Now, my estimates state that the scaling of cure potencies are roughly, if not exactly, 20% lower than damaging potencies, which means we simply subtract 20% from this, and voila! 8,900.8 is our number. Oh yeah, and this time we have also made sure to choose a race with maximum mind to increase the number slightly more. One of those options is Orion Order. We already did that for that 8,900.8. Then we add the crit power, which lands us at 14,374.79. Then we divide the number by 100 and multiply it by the cumulative potency we got before, 2,799.92, and get 402,482.68, which is already pretty massive, dwarfing over an entire tank's health bar. Finally, healing has a smaller variance than damage of only ±3%, so we will assume this will be a high roll for an extra 3%. Landing us at 414,557. But now we add all the extra buffs. Sage itself can apply Physis 2 for a 10% boost as well as 20% from Krasis, bringing our total up to 547,215. Then the Scholar we obviously also have here can boost it by a further 10% beyond the Fey Illumination they already provided, with Protraction, bringing us to 601,937. And then we start to add extra jobs in. Starting with the weakest buff, we have Red Mage with Magic Barrier for 5%, bringing us up to 632,034. Then Astrologians the Arrow adds another 10% to get us up to 695,237, blasting past the damage records. And then we put down White Mage's Asylum for yet another 10%, bringing us to 764,761. And then comes the physical jobs. First with Monk's Mantra bringing an extra 10%, going up to 841,237. And then Bard with Nature's Min for the even bigger 15% boost, up to 967,423. And then, for the grand finale, we set this up on a Warrior with Rampart, 15%, and Thrill of Battle, 20%, active, placing us at a stupidly high 1,335,000 and 43.186. I wonder if this size barrier would allow a player to survive an otherwise lethal attack. A bit of an extra aside is that the Creation Diagnosis can target a player not in your party, and most of the buffs provided increase healing received, which means that if we had more buffs to choose from, we could easily have shoved them into a second or third party in an alliance raid context. Now, the problem is that there are no more buffs, so never mind on that one. That said, there is actually one last thing we can add on top, which is a gem draft for roughly 8% more barrier, pushing us further up to 1,441,846.641. Now, that was a bit quick, so let's also check the biggest party barrier possible. It should come as no surprise that Scholar is the one that has it, and that it revolves around either Adloquium with Dissipation or Manifestation in Seraphism, followed by deployment tactics. The long story short is that since we only get to deploy half of the barrier, and Scholar doesn't have Zoe, but Scholar will have the exact same stat line as Sage, yes I checked, the barrier is exactly a third of the size, peaking at only 480,615.5468. But I mean, a 480,000 party-wide barrier is pretty huge. And while we're here, we can also check for the biggest single heal. And now, some of you might already be thinking, Benediction on Sid and Castor Meridianum, and I hear you. Unfortunately, apparently, Sid's HP bar there was ludicrously exaggerated. I've heard stories suggesting he had over 10 million. He has a whopping, disappointing 259,000, which is not going to be the record, which I'm sure isn't going to surprise anyone. Besides, Sid is only in one duty, so Rule 1 would have disqualified it anyway. But hey, I felt like being ahead on the comments on that one. For another bit of funny science, it turns out that Golbus and Zero, in the newest trial, can also be targeted for healing, or anything else that targets a party member for that matter. Ethereal Manipulation, anyone? However, Benediction heals them for just about 271,000 too, so also not that impressive. Now, the actual record might be a bit surprising, or not at all perhaps, but it is not held by a pure healer, because Scholar's taking this one too. Exactly the same approach, except we use emergency tactics first to turn the barriers into a heal. And unlike barriers, where it produces 2 buffs to split the shield in 2, emergency tactics actually emerges them together into 1 giga heal, making the real heal from Adloquium look like a joke by comparison. And since we aren't doing deployment, this means that this heal peaks at 2/3 of the biggest shield possible, at a whopping 961,231.0937. If we count that small upfront heal from Adloquium 2, then the combined heal peaks at 1,219,466.339. Oh, one last thing. Some of you might be thinking of Macrocosmos as well, since that one scales with damage taken. However, Macrocosmos comes with the asterisk that the scaling heal cannot exceed the target's max HP. And since emergency tactics Adloquium goes above and beyond, healing more than double the HP of any job, this asterisk does prevent Macrocosmos from competing much. So in summary, the biggest possible single barrier produced by our very buff-stacked Creation Diagnosis from Sage peaks at 1,441,847. Then, the biggest possible single heal is the emergency tactics heal of a very buff-stacked Adloquium, which peaks a bit lower than the barrier at 1,219,466. And then, the biggest possible single party barrier is of course that very same Adloquium, but with deployment tactics instead, which means the extra shield from the crit isn't spread, making the shield 480,615.5, times the number of players of course. With that said, Did you expect this result? And also, if you know some way to produce an even bigger heal with some fancy tricks, even if you break the rules, I would love to hear about it. And if you have some ideas for other mathy things to check, be sure to let me know in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi. Links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Shadowbringers, notably before the existence of recitation, Adloquium's effect where it produces 2 shields actually simply doubled the single barrier's size. Incidentally, such a mega barrier to deploy was already insanely strong, to the degree that there were tactics that involved the scholar simply fishing for a crit until they got it. But now, add in a cooldown like recitation that guarantees it? That's too strong. And that's why they split the barrier in 2.